Thank you. All right, so one thing I just wanted to show you is in the pack, you've got this handy little take-home guide. So if you want a quick guide to what we're talking about today, it's a great place to start. So obviously the three of us are going to split this talk up. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the background. And one of the first things that I wanted to say to you is that this is a bit of a Marmite method. People tend to love it or hate it. And it's also kind of a new method still. So part of what we want to do is sort of introduce it to you, and we hope that you're going to love it. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why people don't like it. We're going to start by showing you an example of a story stem from Ginny and Victoria's research using this method on body hair removal practices, just so that you get a bit of a flavour right up front about what this method is about. Sorry. All right, so the cue is that Jane has decided to stop removing her body hair. Obviously, we give them some instructions, and the instructions in this case are quite simple. Please read and complete the following story. Spend at least 10 minutes writing the story. It's quite important when you're working with students, which Nikki will go on and talk about, I think, to say things like that. The thing that I think is important to say at this point is that story completion is quite different from some other ways of collecting data. So most of the methods that are used traditionally in qualitative research, interviewing and focus groups, and quite a few of the methods that are being used today, including qualitative surveys and email interviews that other people are presenting here, actually are about people's personal experience. This is quite different. You're asking people to tell stories. So it's not about their own stuff. So it starts in quite a different place, and that's possibly one of the reasons that some people don't like it at all. Because okay, it's a story. How can you analyse that? What's that about? Okay, so what we're going to do is talk a bit about the history and the background of this as a method, and the development of it as a qualitative method, because that's not where it started. Nikki's going to talk some about design and sampling in this kind of research, because there are some really interesting methodological issues that you need to think about. And Vic's going to talk about the analysis stage and do some conclusions. We've got a picture of Ginny, who you know, so we wanted to make sure that we include her because she's part of the group that we've had over a few years doing research with this methodology. And we wanted to have a picture of Irmgard Tishner, who's also a researcher at UE but couldn't be here today. And we wanted to mention Matt, who I saw a minute ago. Where's Matt? Matt Wood is a prior student but now doing his PhD in Newcastle. Very exciting. Anyway, so I wanted to credit him. And also Iduna Beckley-Shah, who has just successfully defended her PhD using this method. So this is our kind of credit sort of part of the speech. All right, so in terms of the background, I'm a practitioner by training. I'm a counselling psychologist, and I love projective techniques, and I came across them in my training because I was trained to do the Ruleshark and the TAT. So projective techniques are when you give somebody a bit of stimulus material and it's deliberately ambiguous, and you get them to make sense of the material. So this slide on the bottom is from the Ruleshark protocol. People often say it looks like a wolf. I won't tell you what it says about you if you do or don't see that wolf. The key, I think, issue about this is the assumption, because it's a psychoanalytic tradition, is that there is this person of who's only a little bit aware of themselves, hence the sort of classic iceberg image, and that what you're using when you're using a Ruleshark or a projective test, if you're getting them to give you data that they're not actually aware of, so you're reading their responses in terms of telling you things that they are not conscious of, it's part of their unconscious, and or material that they would feel uncomfortable telling you directly. So the Ruleshark has been used in pretty awful ways. So it was used, for example, in the 70s to diagnose homosexuality or lesbianism. Not so great. I want to say in the Ruleshark's defence, because I love it, there's a strong empirical tradition. It's quite useful, and it's useful clinically. I used it once with a bank robber in prison, and that was kind of fun. So it's a good instrument with a long empirical tradition within a very particular clinical positivist context. But what we're doing here is something very different. The other research tradition that is important for projectives is the idea of projectives being used in the context of developmental psychology. So the one that I think is most it's been used for a while now by attachment researchers. So there's a picture here of John Bowlby, obviously, who's the originator of attachment research. And the most famous ones are kind of doll play stories that you do with kids of about 6 or 7 to code their attachment. So you've got the kid, you act out a wee story, there's you, little Johnny, and here's your parents, and oops, we spilt the orange juice all over the floor, what's happening next? And then you pass the dolls over and you get the kid to act it out, and then you code them in various ways based on their response. I think the thing to say about the use of both the Ruleshark and traditions and the kind of doll play type stuff is there are these very complex coding systems that are used to make sense of this complex, storied, textual, verbal data, and what you end up with often is a few numbers or something that can be then coded in a quantitative analysis. And I always think it's a bit of a shame because you take it all down and you shrink it to one thing or a few numbers. So in terms of the development of story completion as a qualitative research tool, the origins of it are probably this person. I'm just going to turn the page, whose name is Martina Horner, and she was a researcher in the US who did this paper in the 70s. And she was very influenced by psychoanalysis, quotes Freud in the paper, for example. And she gave her participants, her female participants, this story stem after first term finals. Anne finds herself at the top of the medical school class, and then she gave a John version to the boys. And then she analysed it and came up with an analysis that argued that women were scared of success. Now, given the time that we're talking, unsurprisingly, there was a huge feminist backlash, and Victoria, I'm just riffling through this. Vic said to me that part of the response that she and Ginny have had from a story completion paper from a reviewer was that the reviewer was still haunted by the memory of Horner's overinterpretation of the data. So this is one of the reasons it's Marmite, because this method has been used to argue things that one might see as being possible to interpret in other ways, shall I say, diplomatically. Okay, so possibly because it was not used, because it had created such an uproar, the method wasn't used then for quite a long time until 95 in Australia. So this is Susan Moore here, second picture down, and she was doing a big study on Menard and used story completion as one of a series of things that she did. It's quite a complex story completion. There are 5 different stems. This is the first one. Jenny rang Sue to ask her to go swimming. She's got a period, what can you do? And what she was interested in is how the story stems said something about how the female participants felt about periods. So she identified common themes such as deception, embarrassment, anxiety, illness, support from others, and problem solving. So basically, thank you, both of these methods are using a kind of essentialist or realist frame. The third method is Deborah Powell and Celia Kitzinger, and they are the first people who are using the method in a way that's more questioning, who suggest that they wrote this paper, they explicitly referenced Horner, they talked about the fact that there are 2 ways to use this method. You can interpret the data as saying something real about the people. So the stories that you tell me something about who you are. The other alternative is to say that the stories that you tell me something about the social constructions around a topic. That's a very different way of understanding it. And what they demonstrate in this paper is 2 different ways of reading data around infidelity. Now, because Ginny's told me I'm out of time and I need to stay on time, just going to say that this is a list of some of the research, and it's a small body of research, predominantly by feminist researchers, that has been published. So although we're all working in it, it's still quite a small number of published studies. This is a bit about that Kitzinger and Powell research, and there are two other reasons why people often hate this method, or it's Marmite for them, is one that it's about the fact that you can use these percentages. So there's this notion that if you report numbers in quant, it's really awful because that's like, what are you doing, some kind of content analysis. But actually, when you've got hundreds of data, you can do that. And that's really quite interesting. It tells you something kind of interesting about the data. And the second thing is that this original study is a comparison. So you've got boys and girls responding to male and female STEM. So that, if you think about it as a chi-square, it's 4 different groups, which means that you can do analysis that's based at looking at the difference between male and female respondents or responses to men and women. Okay? So again, that seems quite quantitative, quite positivist, can be a reason why people don't like the method. All right.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to talking about our work, between us, and Victoria very much started this, but we've been teaching story completion tasks as a way of collecting quality data at UE for around about the last 10 years. We've been teaching to undergraduates and to postgraduates. We've sent undergraduates out and asked them to get their parents to complete story completion tasks for data for assignments they complete. And what we found is that it is a really popular method, and that a lot of our second year undergraduate students go on, having learnt this in their second year at uni, to want to do their projects in their final year using story completion tasks. And so one of the papers that was on the list that Naomi just showed you was a report of Eleanor Walsh's undergraduate project, which her and her supervisor, Helen, who's going to be speaking later, wrote up and managed to get published. So we do see lots and lots of students now coming through and using story completion tasks. And that's one of the reasons why Victoria and Ginny decided that this method, although it's not really published very much at the moment, seems to be something that's really appropriate to include when we're talking about the types of methods that students can use when they're collecting quality data. And that's why they put it into their successful qualitative research book. So what's happened more recently is that a couple of years ago, a group of us got together and we started thinking that this was a really interesting method, and we started really messing around with it a little bit. So here's the people that were involved in our story completion research group, and we've really just been trying to publicise the method a little bit. We've done some talks, we've written a chapter in the book, and we've been playing around with it, and I guess that's also one way just to kind of warn you that we don't necessarily have all the answers. It's not that well used, and it's a method that has lots of potential and lots of opportunity to have some fun with it. But let's have a go at talking about design and sampling and so on in story completion research. So we think it's particularly useful when what you're trying to get to is meaning making around a particular topic. So some people have used it through a constructionist lens, although it doesn't have to be. So you could be exploring understandings and perceptions, or you could be moving into more social and discursive understandings and discourses that you might find in your data. It's particularly useful if you're trying to explore dominant assumptions about a topic, because you're not getting to that topic directly. It's a kind of indirect route into getting responses about a particular topic. So an example of this would be really socially desirable topics, where if participants are given a questionnaire, they would easily know what the correct answer was in a kind of equality climate. So for example, homophobia scales and things like that, you tend to get floor effects. Everybody who takes part in that questionnaire will know what the kind of correct socially desirable answer is to give. But that isn't really the case with story completion, because your cues are less explicit. And also, you're not asking them to actually own what they're writing. You're setting it in a hypothetical context and asking them to write a story about a character, rather than actually asking them to own what they're writing. So it can be really useful for that. The other thing that we found is that it's very useful for sensitive topics as well. So some of the research that has been published has been around things like sex offenders, orgasmic absence, so some really kind of personal and sensitive topics that it can be used for. Another thing that's quite unusual about it is that there is the potential for doing some kind of comparison, which Naomi referred to just a moment ago. So returning to Victoria and Ginny's body hair story completion, their intention was to have a look at the responses of male and female participants to the stories and the ways in which people made sense of Jane removing her body hair and David removing his body hair. But when it came to it, that actually wasn't necessarily the most interesting thing that came out of their data. And I'll leave Victoria to talk about that a little bit more in a moment when we talk about analysis. But there is the potential for unexpected responses and for not being quite sure what you get. And that may be another reason why it's a kind of Marmite method as well that can be embraced, but it can also be a bit daunting when you're not quite sure what's going to be coming out of that. So you can potentially do those kind of comparisons between different groups to the same story, and you can see whether changing a key feature of your story means that you get different responses. So you could change the sexuality of your character, the bodily ability of your character, but the way that it's been explored mostly, this kind of comparative design, is with gender. So there's lots of potential there for going out and looking at other comparative designs to see what sorts of responses you get. And then also thinking about sample size. Sample size has ranged hugely, somewhere between 20 and 200 participants. If you've got comparative designs where you've got multiple stories or you've got multiple groups of people that you want to respond to your stories, then you start to need more people to have the bulk of data, to be looking at a kind of good body of data. The other thing that happens is that sometimes people ask participants to respond to just one version, but sometimes people have asked their participants to respond to up to 6 versions. So you can end up needing a lot of people to take part. Again, returning to the body hair example, Julie and Victoria collected around about 200 responses, 100 to each of the scenarios, and they found that was kind of appropriate. There was enough there to get some diversity and to have some kind of different stories coming through, but it wasn't so much that they felt completely overwhelmed by the data. So I'll hand over to Victoria to talk about how, once you've got your data, you might go about analysing it.
Okay, so the most common way to analyse data is to look for horizontal patterns, so looking across the stories to identify patterns in the data. And most story completion research, and bear in mind we're talking about quite a small body of research, has either used thematic analysis and in a couple of studies discourse analysis, but with a focus on kind of looking at patterns. So this is an example. I should say that Hannah Frith, myself and Ginny were all Celia Kitzinger's PhD students, so that's where our love of story completion comes from our hugely innovative PhD supervisor. So Hannah's research looking at orgasmic absence in the context of heterosexual relationships and looking at 3 themes across the data. I won't kind of talk about them in great detail. If you're interested in the papers and want to find out more about them, I've got a slide at the end, you can email me to get the information. So what you notice is these themes kind of cut across and identify meanings across the stories. The other thing that's a bit more common is doing a more structured analysis. So rather than just being quite open and exploratory and identifying themes, is to start by having some questions that you want to ask of the data, and those questions structuring how you do your thematic analysis. And the reason why this is quite common is because this is what Kitzinger and Powell did in their study. So they looked at depictions of the Q relationship, reasons for infidelity, and responses to infidelity. So they had those 3 questions, and then they identified thematic patterns in relation to those 3 questions. So for example, with the Jane data, when Jane stops removing her body hair, it was a hugely varied data set. Very, very different stories, varied widely from kind of fantasy stories where Jane is part Yeti and goes to live in the wild with her father, who's full Yeti and embraces her hairy body. And then kind of more kind of straightforward, mundane stories. And so what we decided that would work in terms of analysis was asking 3 questions. The reasons why Jane stops removing body hair. What kind of woman stops removing body hair? So how they constructed Jane. And there was lots of really interesting things in the data about how Jane was portrayed and how they made sense of a woman engaging in something which is socially not normative. And then also more broadly looking at the meanings of body hair for women. And so the one that always makes me laugh, which is why I put it up on here, is that unmanaged pubic hair becomes wild and animalistic. So there are lots of descriptions of massive bushes and things like that. And I do apologise if this is all a bit much for you, but I'm a sexuality researcher and a bit desensitised to talking about that kind of thing. The other different thing that we've played around with is trying to analyse the data in a way that captures the patterning in the stories. So the reason why I talked about horizontal patterns is because another thing we've thought about is vertical patterns, so patterns in how the stories unfold. And what's really fun about story completion is the unpredictability of the data, but sometimes you get such consistency in how the story is written. And it's really hard to predict as to whether you'll get that consistency or not. So you won't be able to see this very well, but we can send out the slides. This is an example from an undergraduate student project I supervised. And the story stem was a young woman coming out as lesbian or bisexual to her parents. And so the completions tended to focus on the parental reaction and then how the family came to some kind of resolution of that new information. And what we were able to kind of map out in the data is a kind of patterning in how the stories unfolded. So most of the stories had the parents being shocked at this disclosure, and that was a fairly uniform reaction in the vast majority of stories. Then they develop through either the parents having a positive reaction and welcoming this information, or having a negative reaction. And then the stories can end in various different ways. So if the parents, after their initial shock, react positively, the story's always had a positive ending of welcoming this information, welcoming, I think the character was called Sarah, welcoming her girlfriend into the family and so on. But if there was an initial negative reaction, they could end in one of 3 ways, either positively, negatively, or ambiguously. So the student did a thematic analysis, but complemented it with this kind of vertical pattern mapping technique to retain a sense of the storied nature of the data. To give you another example very quickly, what was really striking about the Jane and David data is the Jane data was hugely varied. It was all over the shop and there was no kind of distinct kind of story going on. The David data was incredibly uniform. It was almost like we told them what they should put in their stories because they were so uniform. So David was always characterised as a young heterosexual man who was very hairy, in the wrong places on his body, that he was teased and bullied for being too hairy, that he sees images of sexy men in the media and sexy men are all hairless, and he has an interest in a particular gal or wants a girlfriend and feels that he's not sexy enough because he's too hairy. So he decides to remove his body hair. And that was very uniform. What was different is how they end, and we had 2 distinct endings. On the one hand, David is punished in some way for being over-invested in appearance, for putting too much emphasis on the outside. So, for example, he has an allergic reaction to the cream, removal cream, collapsed naked outside the bathroom, and his parents take him to hospital in an ambulance. And then in other stories, it all ends happily. and he gets the girl he likes or he gets a girlfriend. So there seems to be it speaks to some kind of ambivalence around kind of masculinity there. So that's an example of a story mapping technique, and that how we would present the analysis, when we ever get around to writing it up, would be to retain that kind of storied structure in writing up the analysis. The other thing that hasn't really been explored, which is why we have a question mark, is narrative analysis. To me, to all of us, it seems the obvious method for analysing story completion data, could take this very kind of straightforward story mapping technique and extend and develop it. But we aren't narrative analysis, we aren't narrative analysts, so we're kind of waiting for someone to come along and say, hey, I'll do this, I'll have a go at this. So any takers, let us know. Just very, very quickly, some of the other possibilities. So an example here is combining story completion with visual methods. So this is Nikki and Matt's research looking at perceptions of appearance using story completion. So people were given a scenario about a young woman preparing for a date, and then after they wrote their story, they were directed to Bitstrips, the animation website, which is hugely fun, and asked to create an image of the character. And then you can see here kind of 3 of the images that were created. Lots of technical and practical issues with doing something like this, but nonetheless, I think it signals that story completion doesn't have to end with getting people just to write stories. There are lots of possibilities for combining story completion with other approaches. So, how are we doing for time?
Got a couple more minutes.
Okay, good. So, some kind of, it's gone wrong. Okay. Conclusions. So, it's a great method if you are in a pressured academic environment, which we all are. You haven't got much time, you haven't got much money, but you still want to do really good, complex, qualitative research. So it makes data collection quite straightforward and easy, so you can invest all your time in analysing the data. You can collect data online, so you can use things like Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey, so you can get people to write stories online. Obviously, it depends on the population that you're collecting data from. And you can get large samples quickly and efficiently. We've mostly collected data from students. They're obviously used to writing stories. They're used to typing on computers. We've sometimes gone into big lecture theatres and asked them to participate, and in that one shot of half an hour you get kind of 150 kind of completion, so it's relatively quick. The student, Naomi mentioned, Aduna, has used story completion with a general population sample and with therapists, and it did seem to work quite well, but we're interested in people using the method on other populations so we can understand how it works with a non-student population. It's great for perceptions, great for constructions, but not personal experience unless you combine it with something else. It's great for sensitive and ethically, morally complex topics. That's one of the reasons why we think it's really good for student research, because they can really get stuck into complex topics, but we don't worry about the fact that they're going off to interview people where they don't have the skills and training and experience to do that. So I have students come to me and say, I want to do something on domestic violence, and I want to interview people who have experienced domestic violence. Like, no, this is an undergraduate project, that's not going to happen, but how about do a story completion? So it's non-intrusive, less kind of ethically challenging. And the thing I really love is it's fun. And research should be fun. It should be playful, as far as I'm concerned. And it's fun for the participants. I will often get, I've got a study up on the participant pool here at Year 8 at the moment. I'll often get students email me afterwards and say, just want to say, that was really fun, I really enjoyed that. So it's fun for participants, but it's also fun for researchers as well. There are, very briefly, some downsides. The data is unpredictable, but I find that really exciting. You never know what you're going to get. We didn't know the David data would all be really storied, and the Jane data would be all over the shop. And that, to me, is exciting, but it can also be daunting. There's a huge variation in how people complete stories. You can get 2 lines. You can get reams with dialogue and, and narratives extending over long periods of time, so people can engage very differently with it. And as we've kind of highlighted, it's new. So there's still lots we don't know, but we hope we can encourage you to play with it. Just to signal some resources, as Nikki mentioned, we cover it in our book that hopefully will be on sale at lunchtime. We've got story completion data sets on our companion website for use in teaching, and also research materials if you want to do your own story completion research. We've got some chapters coming out. Hopefully we'll be presenting story completion research at the Southwest Quality Symposium, and at some vague point in the future we will write a book on it. So there is a contract, but you know, there's several books in front of it before we get there. So just to leave you with this, if you want all the papers I've cited, if you want these slides, if you want some slides from other talks, just send me an email, and I've got the email ready to go to send back to you. Okay, Ginny's been waving at me for some time, so I'll leave it there.